the day Clarence Maddox rode into Harlan Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1883. The sky was the color of a bruise healing at the edges, and the smell of burnt cornbread drifting from the third house on the left told him something in this town was quietly falling apart. He pulled his roan mare, Ruby, to a slow walk along the main road, taking in the weathered storefronts and the cottonwood trees that had gone gold and brittle in the October chill. Harlan Creek was not a large town. It had a general store run by a man named Hooper, a blacksmith shop, a small church with a listing steeple, a saloon called the Dusty Boot that smelled permanently of tobacco and regret, and a scattering of homes set back from the road behind fence posts and dry gardens. Clarence had ridden through dozens of towns like this one in the years since he had left his father's ranch outside of Abilene. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were cracked from weather and work. He carried a bedroll, a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard, a worn leather satchel full of veterinary tools and medicines, and a reputation in 4 counties as a man who could save horses other men had given up on. He was not looking for trouble. He was not looking for anything in particular except a livery stable, a meal, and maybe a few days of work before the weather pushed him further south. What he found instead was Ella Fairchild. She was standing on the porch of that third house, the one with the burnt cornbread smell, wearing a faded blue dress and holding a cast iron skillet as though she was not quite sure what she intended to do with it. She was perhaps 28, with dark auburn hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck and green eyes that caught the late afternoon light in a way that made Clarence slow Ruby without consciously deciding to do so. She was not beautiful in the soft, easy way of women in parlor portraits. She was beautiful the way the land around her was beautiful, with a kind of worn honesty to it, a depth that came from having survived something. She looked at the skillet. She looked at the smoke, rising thin and black from the kitchen window behind her. She set the skillet down on the porch railing with a sound like resignation, and she pressed both hands flat against the painted wood and stared out at nothing at all. Clarence tipped his hat. "Evening, ma'am," she turned. She seemed not to have noticed him until that moment. Up close he could see that her eyes were tired in a way that sleep alone did not cause. "Evening," she said quietly. "Something burning." She looked back at the window. "Everything I cook burns," she said, and there was no self-pity in it. It was simply a fact she had stated, the way a person might say the creek runs west or the fence needs mending. "Cornbread," he guessed. "What is left of it?" She almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was close enough that Clarence noticed it. "You passing through, planning on it," he said. "I was told there is a livery at the end of Main Street. Is that still the case?" "Mr. Deacon runs it. He is usually there until dark." She tilted her head slightly. "You are a rancher." "Veterinarian," he said. "Mostly horses, sometimes cattle." Something shifted in her expression just faintly. "My husband used to say that a man who could heal a horse was worth 10 men who could only ride one." "Used to say." Clarence heard the past tense like a stone dropped into still water. He held it gently, did not press it. "Your husband was a wise man," he said simply. "He was," she agreed. She picked up the skillet again. "Good evening, sir." "Good evening, ma'am." He rode on toward the livery, and he told himself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Deacon's livery was exactly where it had been described, and Deacon himself was a small, wiry man of about 60, with the disposition of a man who had been in a slow argument with the world for several decades, and was not yet prepared to concede. He took Clarence's mare without much ceremony, named a fair price for a week's boarding, and then squinted at Clarence with the frank appraisal of a man who had seen every kind of drifter pass through his establishment. "Veterinarian, you say? You any good?" "I have been told so by horses and cattlemen alike," Clarence said. Deacon nodded slowly. "Hooper's got a draft horse with a lame front leg. Could be a stone bruise, could be worse. He has been threatening to put the animal down for 2 weeks, but he is too cheap to hire the shooter and too soft to do it himself." Deacon paused. "Could be some work in that for you if you want it." "I will speak to him in the morning," Clarence said. He got a room at the Dusty Boot, which served as both saloon and rooming house, for 50 cents a night. The room was small and smelled of old wood and horsehair, but the mattress was better than the ground, and that was all he required. He ate supper at the bar, a plate of beans and salt pork that was unremarkable but edible, and he drank 1 glass of whiskey and listened to the town breathe around him. He heard Ella Fairchild's name for the first time from a pair of ranchers at the far end of the bar. They were not speaking unkindly of her, not exactly, but there was a certain weary concern in their voices that told him she was a woman the town watched with a kind of helpless care. "Saw smoke coming out of her kitchen window again," one of them said. He was a large man with a red beard, a rancher named Turnbull, whose name Clarence would learn the next day. "3rd time this week." "She has been that way since Thomas died," the other man said. He was younger, with dust on his collar. "That is going on 2 years now. Woman just does not eat right. I heard from Martha Hooper that she went a whole day last month without a proper meal, just coffee and hardtack." "Somebody ought to do something," Turnbull said. "Everybody says somebody ought to do something," the younger man replied. "Nobody knows what the something is." They finished their drinks and moved on to other conversation, and Clarence stared at the amber color in his glass and thought about a woman on a porch holding a skillet like she had forgotten what it was for. He did not intend to involve himself. He had no business involving himself. He was a man passing through, and Harlan Creek was a stopping point, not a destination. He fell asleep that night listening to the wind pick up outside and thinking about green eyes in the late afternoon light, and in the morning he went to find Hooper about the horse. Hooper's draft horse was a Belgian mare named Pearl, and she was not as bad off as Deacon had suggested. Clarence found a deep stone bruise on her left front hoof, cleaned it carefully, packed it with a poultice of pine tar and tallow, and wrapped it with clean linen from his satchel. He instructed Hooper to keep the horse off the hoof for 10 days and to change the packing every 2 days, and Hooper paid him $1.50 and stared at the horse with the relieved expression of a man reprieved from a difficult decision. "You are good at that," Hooper said. "It is what I do," Clarence said. Hooper was a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair and the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades measuring things. His wife Martha, Clarence gathered, was the woman who had told someone that Ella Fairchild had gone without a proper meal. Martha herself was visible through the open door of the store, a stout, cheerful woman who waved at Clarence with the easy familiarity of someone who considered any man her husband had paid $1.50 to be automatically trustworthy. "You know anything about wagon wheels?" Hooper asked. "Some," Clarence said. "I have a wagon with a cracked rear wheel. Nothing fancy, just needs a new fellow piece and some proper setting. Blacksmith says he is too busy until next week." Hooper paused. "I would pay fair. I can look at it," Clarence said. He spent the rest of the morning in Hooper's yard working on the wagon wheel, and it was there, just before noon, that Ella Fairchild came into the general store, and he saw her properly for the first time in daylight. She wore the same faded blue dress. He was not certain she owned another. She carried a small basket, and she moved through the store with the deliberate quietness of someone who has learned not to take up too much space. Martha Hooper greeted her with warm and slightly overcompensating cheerfulness, the kind reserved for people who are being gently managed by their community. Ella received it with grace and patience, smiling at Martha with genuine affection even as something behind her eyes remained carefully closed off. She bought coffee and salt and a small amount of flour and a tin of sardines. She did not buy any meat. She did not buy vegetables. She did not buy eggs. Clarence was watching through the open barn door of Hooper's yard, and he told himself he was not staring. He was simply observing. It was a habit he had developed over years of reading animals, of watching for the subtle signs of pain or deficiency that were not obvious until you knew what to look for. And everything about the way Ella Fairchild moved through that store told him something that the townspeople had put a name to without understanding the cause. She was not feeding herself. Not truly. She was performing the minimum gestures of survival without any actual intention behind them, the way a clock keeps ticking for a little while even after it has been wound for the last time. He finished the wagon wheel repair by early afternoon, collected his pay from Hooper, and stood in the street outside the store for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. He told himself 3 times that it was not his business. He told himself that he would be leaving in a few days, and that whatever was wrong in Ella Fairchild's kitchen was not a problem he had been called to solve. Then he walked around to the back of the store where Hooper kept a small kitchen garden and knocked on the gate. Martha Hooper appeared. She looked surprised and then immediately interested in the specific way of a woman who has been waiting for someone to do something and is pleased that the someone has arrived. "Mr. Maddox," she said, "can I help you?" "I was wondering," Clarence said carefully, "if you might be able to tell me something about the woman who was just in your store, Mrs. Fairchild." Martha Hooper's expression went through several calculations very quickly. She was a perceptive woman. "What would you like to know?" "Just that she is all right," he said. "She lives alone." "She does. Her husband Thomas died almost 2 years ago. November will be 2 years. Martha wiped her hands on her apron. "He was a good man, fell from a horse, broke his neck. It was sudden and terrible, and Ella has never quite found her footing again." She paused. "She has her daughter with her, Lucy. She is 7 years old, and she is with Ella's sister on the neighboring farm most days because Ella, well," Martha stopped herself. "She is managing. The child is cared for. Her sister Vera and Vera's husband see to Lucy while Ella keeps the house, or tries to. The neighbors leave food sometimes. She does not always eat it." Martha looked at him with the directness of a woman who had been worrying about this for too long. "Why do you ask, Mr. Maddox?" "No particular reason," Clarence said, and he heard how unconvincing he sounded. "I just noticed she bought very little food." Martha nodded slowly. "She cooks," she said. "She does cook. But she told me once, just once, that she cannot taste it anymore. That everything she makes comes out wrong, and she cannot bring herself to care enough to make it come out right. I think she learned to cook for Thomas, and now she does not know who she is cooking for." She looked at her garden for a moment. "It worries me terribly." Clarence thanked her and walked back to the street. He stood in the October sunlight thinking about a woman who could not taste her own cooking, and a child who was being looked after by relatives, and a house that sent up smoke signals of burnt cornbread like a ship in distress. He was a man who fixed things. It was not a virtue exactly. It was simply the only language he was fluent in. He went to the general store and spent 60 cents he did not strictly need to spend on a good piece of cured ham, a bag of dried beans, some onions, a wedge of hard cheese, and a jar of molasses. He packed them into a flour sack and he walked to the 3rd house on the left. She answered the door before he knocked. She had been standing at the window, apparently, watching the street. She looked at the flour sack and then at him and then at the flour sack again. "Mr. Maddox," she said. "Mrs. Fairchild," he said, "I found myself with more supplies than I can use before I move on. I wondered if you might spare me the trouble of carrying them." Her green eyes were careful. She was not a foolish woman. She knew perfectly well what he was doing. He could see her working through whether to be grateful or insulted, and he waited. "That is very kind," she said finally, with the measured tone of someone accepting an offered hand without being certain whether to trust it. "May I bring them inside?" She hesitated. Then she stepped back from the door. The interior of the house was clean. Whatever else had slipped away from her, she kept the floors swept and the windows clear of dust. There were curtains at the windows that had once been pretty and were now simply old. On the mantelpiece was a tintype photograph of a man with a broad jaw and earnest eyes, and beside it, a small bouquet of dried wildflowers that had been there long enough to lose all their color. There was a child's drawing tacked to the wall near the kitchen door, a horse and a house in red pencil crayon. The kitchen smelled of the residue of 100 burned meals, an undertone of char beneath the cleaner smell of soap and wood smoke. Clarence set the flour sack on the table without comment. "You do not have to do this," Ella said. She was standing in the doorway between the front room and the kitchen, her arms folded loosely across her middle. "I know it," he said. I manage fine." "I am sure you do," he said, and he said it without a trace of condescension, which was why she did not immediately ask him to leave. He looked at the stove. It was a good cast iron range, a little older but sound. The firebox was barely warm. There was a pot on the surface with something gray in it that might once have been porridge and had given up the effort. "Would you mind," he said, "if I made a fire and showed you something with these beans?" The silence that followed was the longest of the afternoon. He watched her face do something complicated, anger and gratitude and grief all trying to occupy the same expression at once, and he waited without pushing. "I know how to cook beans," she said. "I have no doubt," he said, "but I know a particular way with ham and molasses that I learned from a woman in San Antonio who ran the best boarding house in 4 counties, and I have not been able to make it properly for myself because it is a recipe meant for more than one person." He paused. "It is nothing but an excuse to share a meal. I will not pretend otherwise." Something in the careful set of her shoulders loosened, very slightly. "That is honest," she said. "I try to be," he said. She watched him for another moment, and then she moved to the stove and began to rebuild the fire herself, because she was not a woman who would stand by while someone else did work in her own kitchen. He spent the afternoon in Ella Fairchild's kitchen. He soaked the beans in a pot of water. He trimmed and sliced the ham. He showed her the ratio of molasses to water to salt that gave the beans their depth, and he talked while he worked, not about her or her grief or the photograph on the mantelpiece, but about the places he had been and the horses he had worked with, and a particular coyote that had followed him for 3 days through the Llano Estacado one winter, and then simply vanished one morning, as though it had decided he was not interesting enough to follow further. She listened. At first she stood at a careful distance, watching him with her arms folded, waiting for the thing that would make her regret letting him in. Slowly, the distance closed. She came to stand near enough to see what he was doing with the molasses, and then near enough to stir the pot herself when he offered the spoon, and then she was standing at the stove cooking her own beans with her own hands, and there was no clear moment when it had stopped being his doing and become hers. The kitchen filled with the smell of good food. It was a slow, deep, sweet salt smell, the kind that reaches into the back of the throat and the base of the chest and says something is right here, something is being made and cared for. Ella stopped stirring. She stood very still with the spoon in her hand. Clarence was cutting the cheese at the table, and he looked up and saw her face, and what was on it was something so naked and startled that he put down the knife. She was not crying yet. She was at the edge of it, standing at the border of something. This is the first time since she stopped. She pressed her lips together. "It smells like a meal," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a way she clearly had not intended and could not prevent. "It is a meal," he said quietly. I could not. She set the spoon down on the edge of the pot with a careful precision that spoke of a woman holding herself together with both hands. I could not make it smell like a meal. Every time I tried, it was wrong. It tasted like nothing, or it burned, or it was just sustenance, just fuel. I could not make it be food anymore. "You were not cooking for yourself," he said, "not as a diagnosis, just as an observation, the way you would note that a horse was favoring its left side." She turned and looked at him. "You were feeding grief," he said, "not hunger." The words landed in the quiet kitchen the way a stone breaks the surface of still water, and the rings spread out, and Ella Fairchild's face came apart. She did not sob loudly. She was not a woman who did things loudly. She wept the way the land weeps in a dry season, slowly, with tremendous effort, as though every tear had been held back for so long that releasing it required a physical act of surrender. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and she turned toward the window so her back was to him, and her shoulders shook with the effort of breathing through it. Clarence Maddox did not move closer. He did not offer her empty comfort. He simply stayed. He stood in her kitchen with his hands at his sides, and he let her weep without filling the space with words or gestures. Because some people need to be allowed to grieve in front of a witness, without being asked to stop. When the worst of it had passed, she wiped her face with the hem of her apron and turned around. Her eyes were red and her composure was that of someone who has just been through a storm and is assessing the damage. "I apologize," she said. "Do not," he said. "You are a stranger," she said. "Sometimes that is why it is easier," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the spoon again and stirred the beans. "They will be ready in another hour," she said. "I know it," he said. He sat down at her kitchen table, and they talked through the rest of the afternoon until the beans were done. And when they ate, Ella Fairchild ate a full plate of food for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, and she tasted every bite. He said good evening and walked back to the dusty boot in the dark, and he lay on his narrow mattress staring at the ceiling, and he knew with a certainty that had nothing sentimental about it, and everything honest about it, that he was not leaving Harlan Creek in a few days. The next morning he went back to Hooper's store and asked about any ranches in the area that might need veterinary work. Hooper gave him 3 names without hesitation, and added a 4th with the knowing smile of a man who had noticed things. Clarence spent 3 days riding out to the surrounding ranches, examining horses and cattle, treating a case of equine thrush at the Turnbull Ranch, pulling a badly infected tooth from a roping horse at a place called the Double Y, and advising a young rancher named Collins about the winter feeding of a dairy cow that had been showing signs of mineral deficiency. He earned enough to cover his room at the Dusty Boot for 2 weeks, and he arranged to keep Ruby at Deacon's livery in exchange for examining and treating Deacon's own 3 horses, 2 of which had minor issues, and 1 of which had a more serious case of rain rot that required careful daily treatment with a copper sulfate wash. He went to Ella's house each evening, not every evening. 3 of those first 7 days he did not go, because he was careful about the shape a thing could take, and he was not a man who moved without watching where he was stepping. But on the 4th day she opened the door before he had finished the walk up the porch steps, which told him she had been watching for him, and on the 6th day she had the stove lit and a pot of water already on when he arrived, and that told him she had been planning, which meant she had been thinking forward, which was different from before. Her daughter Lucy came home on the 6th day, too. Ella had sent for her from Vera's farm, and the child arrived in a small wagon driven by Vera's husband, a taciturn man named Cal Briggs, who looked at Clarence with the specific scrutiny of a protective relation, and said nothing, but whose eyes said considerable things. Lucy was 7 years old, and she had her mother's green eyes and her father's broad jaw, and she was at that age where the world is still largely a matter of curiosity and adventure. She looked at Clarence with unguarded assessment for about 30 seconds, and then announced that she had a tooth that was loose and would he like to see it. "I would," he said. She demonstrated, and he confirmed that it was indeed very loose and would likely come out within the week, and she seemed pleased with this prognosis. Ella watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway with an expression that was soft in a way it had not been before Lucy arrived. The presence of her daughter did something to the house. It restored a particular pitch of ordinary life that had been missing, the specific chaos of a child's shoes left by the door, and a child's questions filling the air, and a child's absolute certainty that the world was fundamentally interesting. It also meant that Ella cooked with purpose. Clarence had noticed that the burned meals and the gray porridge were the products of solitude. With Lucy at the table demanding to know why beans were brown, and whether horses could eat molasses too, and whether Mr. Maddox had ever seen a real bear, Ella stood at the stove and she cooked with her hands and her attention both engaged, and the food came out right. "You are much better when you have someone to cook for," Clarence observed one evening, washing up the dishes while Ella dried them and Lucy sat at the table practicing her letters on a piece of brown paper. "I always was," Ella said quietly, so Lucy would not hear the weight in it. "I just forgot how to be that again." "You remembered fast," he said. She glanced at him. There was something in that glance, the beginning of something she was not yet ready to name, but she did not look away as quickly as she would have a week before. He learned her story in pieces over those evenings, not through direct questions, but through the natural accretion of conversation between two people who are beginning to trust each other. Thomas Fairchild had come to Harlan Creek 9 years before as a land buyer and had stayed for Ella, who was then 20 years old and working at her family's small farm north of town. They had married within a year and built the house on the main road together, and Thomas had set up as a livestock dealer with enough success that they were comfortable without being wealthy. He had been 31 when he died, which meant he had been only 30 when the accident happened, and Ella had been 26, and she had been 26 with a 5-year-old daughter and a grief she did not know the geography of and no map provided. He was the kind of man, she told Clarence one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch after Lucy had been put to bed, the night air sharp with the first real cold of October, who would come into the kitchen and just start talking about anything. About what he had seen that day, or what he was planning, or a funny thing one of the horses did. And I would cook and listen and talk back, and the food would come out right because there was a reason for it. There was a person the flavor was going toward. She was quiet for a moment. When he was gone, I kept cooking, but the flavor had nowhere to go. Does that make any sense at all? Complete sense, Clarence said. She looked at her hands in her lap. I fed Lucy. I always made sure Lucy had proper meals, but for myself she shook her head. I went through the motions. And the more I went through the motions, the worse it got. The food knew I was not sincere about it. Food has a way of knowing that, Clarence said. She laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, as though she had not expected to laugh and was not quite sure what to do with it now that it had happened. But it was real, and it was unguarded, and Clarence heard it and felt something move in his chest that he chose not to examine too carefully just yet. "Tell me about your family," she said. "I have been talking about mine for a week, and I realize I know almost nothing about you." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "My father raised horses outside of Abilene," he said. "He was a hard man. Not cruel, but hard in the way that the land makes some men hard, all edges and practicality and not much room for softness. I learned everything I know about horses from him, and I learned the value of moving forward from him, but I also learned early that I could not stay where the air was that thin. You left home young, 18, he said. I went to work for a veterinarian in Fort Worth, a man named Dr. Hollenbeck, who had studied in Missouri and was the best-educated animal doctor I had ever met. He taught me proper medicine, not just the folk cures and the rough and ready treatment of ranch hands. I worked with him for 4 years, and then I started moving." He paused. "I have been moving since." She looked at him with a directness that was one of the things he had come to find most striking about her. She did not circle around questions. She gathered herself and asked them plainly. "Why?" she said. "Are you running from something?" "No," he said honestly. "I was looking for something, I think, but I am not always certain what." "Did you ever find it?" He looked at her. The porch lamp was casting warm light across her face, and her hair was down from its pins, the way she wore it in the evenings, and the night air was moving through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like distant water. "I am beginning to think I might have," he said. She did not look away. A color came into her cheeks, visible even in the lamplight, and then she looked down at her hands, and he could see the small smile she was trying to contain, and he was glad for the darkness because he was smiling too, and he was not yet ready for her to see how much. The following Sunday she took him to church, which in Harlan Creek was not a small thing. Church was the social mechanism of the town, the place where relationships were publicly registered and assessed, and walking through the door with a man who was not your late husband was a statement that the entire congregation would read and discuss and hold opinions about for the rest of the week. Ella seemed to know this and had chosen it anyway. The church was a small white building presided over by a minister named Reverend Aldis, a thin, cheerful man from Georgia, who had the rare quality of making his sermons interesting without making them long. He shook Clarence's hand with visible pleasure and no apparent surprise, and several of the townspeople followed his lead with warmth that told Clarence He had made a good impression during his week of work around the ranches. Turnbull, the red-bearded rancher, caught him after the service and told him that the horse he had treated was already moving better, and asked whether Clarence might consider something more permanent. He was vague about what exactly he meant by permanent, but the word itself hung in the autumn air and Clarence filed it away. Martha Hooper embraced Ella and told her she looked better, and Ella said she supposed she was eating more regularly, and Martha Hooper looked at Clarence with the triumphant expression of someone who has been proven correct about something they had been hoping for. Cal Briggs, Ella's brother-in-law, was also there with Vera and Lucy, who had spent the night there. Cal Briggs found his moment to speak to Clarence privately while the women talked and Lucy ran in circles around the churchyard with 2 other children. "You planning to stay in Harlan Creek?" Cal asked. He was a lean, weathered man of 35 with the careful economy of speech of someone who conserved words the way a desert conserves water. "I am considering it," Clarence said. "Ella is not a woman to be trifled with," Cal said. "No," Clarence agreed. "She is not. Thomas was my wife's brother," Cal said. "Lucy is my niece. The Fairchild family looks after their own." "I would expect nothing less," Clarence said. Cal studied him for a moment with the frank assessment of a man reading terrain. Then he nodded once and walked away, which Clarence took correctly as provisional acceptance. Lucy ran up to Clarence and announced that her loose tooth had come out during the night, and she had found it in her pillow and she wanted to show him. And he crouched down to look at the small gap in her smile, and told her it was an excellent tooth, very well formed, and she should be proud of it. She beamed at him with the complete and uncomplicated affection of a child who had made up her mind about someone, and was not inclined to revisit the question. Walking back from church, Lucy between them and holding both their hands, Ella glanced at Clarence over the top of Lucy's head, and there was something in her face, gratitude and something deeper, something she was beginning to let herself feel without yet knowing what to do with it. He fixed a broken porch step that afternoon. He had noticed it the week before, a rotted board on the front porch that Ella had been carefully stepping over, and he had picked up the replacement lumber from Hooper's store on the way back from church. Lucy handed him nails with tremendous seriousness and reported each one to her mother as though she were overseeing a major engineering project. When the step was done and tested and declared sound, Ella brought out 2 cups of coffee, and they sat on the porch while Lucy drew pictures in the dirt with a stick, and the afternoon light slanted long and golden across the brown grass of the yard. "Thomas built this porch," Ella said. "He built it the summer before Lucy was born. He was terrible with wood, actually. He was good with animals and accounts and people, but not with wood. It took him 2 weeks and a lot of the language I will not repeat in front of the child." She smiled at the memory, a real smile, unguarded. "He was proud of it anyway. He sat out here every evening in good weather." "It is a good porch," Clarence said. "You are kind," she said. "I mean it genuinely," he said. "Whatever the difficulty of construction, a porch that has been sat on and lived on and loved has a quality that a perfect carpenter's porch does not." She looked at him. "You have a particular way of seeing things," she said. "I have noticed it. You look at things and you find the worth in them even when it is not the obvious kind." "I have worked with horses most of my life," he said. "Horses that other men have written off. I learned early that worth is not always advertised. Sometimes it is just quietly there, waiting for someone to notice it." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has content, that says more than words and asks a question without asking it. "Clarence," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. He felt it the way you feel the first warm day after winter, not dramatically, just as a fact that changes everything. "I want you to know that I am aware of what this has been, what you have been doing, and I am grateful. But I am also," she paused, choosing carefully, "I am also not entirely sure that gratitude is all of what I am feeling, and I need you to know that it frightens me." "I know it," he said. "I am not in a particular hurry." "It has only been 2 years," she said. Some people would say that is not long enough. Some people are not you, he said, and I do not think grief has a schedule. I think you have been grieving properly and fully for 2 years, and you have done right by Thomas and right by Lucy, and you have held this together with your bare hands when most people would have let it fall. I do not think moving forward is a betrayal of that. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Were you always this perceptive?" "No," he said. "I spent a good portion of my 20s being considerably less thoughtful. I am trying to do better." She laughed again, and this time she let it be full, and it was the most beautiful sound Clarence Maddox had heard in a very long time. October turned toward November, and the cold deepened, and the cottonwoods went bare, and the light became the thin, precise light of late autumn. Clarence had by this point become a fixed element of the landscape of Harlan Creek. He had taken on a loosely formal arrangement with 3 of the surrounding ranches to provide regular veterinary services, enough work to make his staying financially sensible, and he had moved from the dusty boot into a small rented room in a house at the edge of town, belonging to an elderly widow named Mrs. Comstock, who charged him $1 a week, fed him breakfast in the mornings, and regarded him with the approving scrutiny of a woman who has been collecting information about his visits to the Fairchild house and has found no cause for complaint. He continued going to Ella's in the evenings. The shape of it had evolved. He no longer brought groceries because she was buying her own and keeping the kitchen properly stocked, and she no longer needed him to start the fire or explain the ratios of ingredients. She cooked and he sat at her table and they talked, and sometimes she handed him things to taste and asked his opinion. And his opinion was always honest, and she received it in kind. It became one of the particular intimacies of their developing relationship, the way she would look at him over the pot or the pan, waiting for his assessment, trusting it, and the way he would deliver it not as judgment but as care. He also began to understand something about Ella Fairchild that he had not fully understood at first, which was that she was not a woman who was waiting to be saved. She had never been waiting to be saved. She was a woman who had been wounded and had continued to function in every dimension that mattered, who had kept her child safe and her home intact and her community relationships warm and reciprocal, and whose only real failure had been the specific and private failure of not being able to feed herself properly, because everything she knew about cooking had been intertwined with a particular kind of love that was no longer present. She had not needed saving. She had needed to remember that the capacity for that kind of love was not Thomas's property but her own. He told her this one evening in November, sitting by the fire after Lucy was in bed, and she looked at him for a long time after he said it, and then she said, "How did you know to say exactly that?" "I have been paying attention," he said. "To me, to you," he said, "for several weeks now, quite carefully." She was sitting in the chair across from him, and the fire was throwing warm, shifting light across her face, and her hands were still in her lap, and she was looking at him with an expression that had come entirely open, all the careful management of it put away. "Clarence," she said, "what are we doing?" "I believe we are falling in love," he said. "At least I can speak with confidence that I am. I do not want to put words to what you are or are not doing." She stood up from the chair. He stood up too because the moment required it, and they were standing close to each other in the firelight, and she was looking up at him with those green eyes, and she said, "I think I am too, falling in love. I think I have been for some time, and I have been trying very hard not to." "Why?" he said. "Because it is terrifying," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is. And because the last time I loved someone I lost him, and it nearly took me down with the losing," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not sure I could survive losing someone again," she said, and she said it not as a warning but as a confession, an honest accounting of her own vulnerability. "You could," he said. "You are one of the strongest people I have ever met. I would never underestimate what you could survive. But I am also going to tell you plainly that I do not intend to be lost if I can help it, and I intend to be very careful about staying, and I intend to spend a considerable amount of time right here in Harlan Creek if you will have me." She reached up and put her hand against his cheek, the way a person touches something they are afraid might not be real. He turned his face slightly into her hand. They stood like that for a moment in the firelight and the quiet, and then she rose on her toes and kissed him, briefly and softly, and with all the deliberateness of a woman who has made a considered and fully intentional decision. He kissed her back. His hands came up to her face, gently, carefully, the same hands that had packed a draft horse's hoof and repaired a wagon wheel and been offered silently to a woman who was weeping, and he held her with a tenderness that he had not known he had so much of until he was in the presence of someone worth giving it to. They stood there for a long time. The fire settled and the wind moved through the eaves of the house, and somewhere down the road someone's dog barked twice and went quiet. When they finally separated, both of them were different in some small but irreversible way, the way things are after the season actually turns. "I should go home," he said. "I know it," she said. "Can I come back tomorrow?" She smiled at him with her whole face. "I was going to make a proper pot roast," she said, "the way my mother taught me. I have not made it in 2 years. Then I will definitely come back tomorrow," he said. He walked back to Mrs. Comstock's house in the November dark, and the stars were extraordinary, the way they always are when you have stopped looking at the ground long enough to look up. And he thought about Ella Fairchild making pot roast for the first time in 2 years, and he was happier than he had been in years himself. The pot roast was extraordinary. It was the kind of meal that announces itself with smell long before it is ready, that fills the house and says plainly that someone in this kitchen is cooking with the full weight of their attention and their heart behind it. Ella had started it in the morning and let it go all day, and by the time Clarence arrived it had been going for 8 hours, and the smell reached him halfway up the path to the front door. Lucy answered the door and pulled him in by the hand before he could knock properly, talking the entire time about the pot roast and how Mama had been cooking it all day, and how she had been allowed to add the rosemary, which was 2 whole sprigs and very important. He sat at the table and watched Ella at the stove, and she was entirely herself, cooking with the fluid ease of a woman who had come back to something she had nearly forgotten she was. She moved with confidence and pleasure, tasting and adjusting her color high from the stove heat and her hair coming loose around her face in the way it did when she had been busy. When she brought the pot to the table and served it, she looked at him while he took the first bite, and he knew what she was asking without her asking it. He set down his fork. "Ella," he said. "Is it right?" she asked. "It is the best thing I have eaten in longer than I can tell you," he said. She sat down. She served herself and she ate, and he watched the particular expression on her face of a person tasting their own cooking and finding it good, finding it more than good, finding it the specific complicated pleasure of a thing that has been reclaimed after being lost. Lucy talked through the entire meal about the rosemary and horses, and the fact that her friend Clara at school had a new kitten, and Ella and Clarence looked at each other across the table over Lucy's head with the quiet, warm complicity of 2 people sharing something together. After dinner and after Lucy was in bed and the dishes were done, Ella sat across from him at the cleared table and said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "What happens in the spring?" she said. "You said you have always moved. What happens when the weather turns and the road opens up and your nature says it is time to go somewhere else?" He looked at her steadily. "My nature," he said slowly, "has been arguing with me about this very question for about 3 weeks. My nature says that I am a man who does not stay in one place for long. My nature says that the arrangement I have with these ranches is temporary and that there is no reason to call it permanent." He paused. "But my nature is arguing against the rest of me now, and the rest of me is winning." "You sound uncertain," she said. "I am certain about you," he said. "I am certain about Lucy. I am less certain about what I deserve, which is a different kind of uncertainty." "Why would you not deserve it?" she said, with a directness that cut through everything. He was quiet. "I have spent 14 years moving," he said. "I have never built anything, never stayed long enough to make anything real. I am good at what I do, but I have always walked away from the making of something lasting. He looked at his hands. I am not sure I know how. Neither did Thomas when he came here, she said gently. He had been a trader all his life, moving with the seasons. He stayed because he decided to stay. That was the whole of it. It sounds simple when you say it that way, he said. It is simple, she said. It is just not easy. Those are different things. He looked at her for a long moment and then he said, will you give me until spring to be certain? Not because I doubt what I feel, but because I want to be sure I am deciding as a man who is building forward, not a man who is just afraid of losing what he has found. That is an honest thing to ask, she said. You deserve honesty. Yes, she agreed. I do. She stood and took his empty coffee cup. You have until spring, she said. And for what it is worth, I already know what I want. I am not telling you to rush. I am just telling you so you know where I stand. I know where you stand, he said. I find it the most solid ground I have ever encountered. Winter came to Harlan Creek in earnest in December, and the cold drove the town into its own interior life, into the warmth of hearths and close quarters, and the particular winter sociability of people who are thrown together by weather. Clarence's work with the ranches did not stop entirely in winter. There were still animals to care for and ailments that did not respect the season, but it slowed enough that he spent more time in town, more time at Ella's. He brought Lucy a set of carved wooden horses from the general store for Christmas, small figures that Hooper had gotten in from a woodworker in San Antonio, and Lucy received them with a solemnity that told him she understood they were a serious gift. Ella gave him a new pair of work gloves, leather, well-made, and he wore them so constantly afterward that they became almost an extension of him. Christmas dinner at the Fairchild house included Vera and Cal and their 2 children, a boy of 10 named James and a girl of 5 named Ruth, and the house was full of noise and warmth and food. Much food, Ella and Vera working together in the kitchen with the easy shorthand of sisters who had learned to cook in the same kitchen, and the result was the best meal Clarence had eaten since he could remember. Cal Briggs cornered him after dinner while the women washed up and the children played and the fire burned low and told him, without preamble and with the direct economy that was his way, that he had made a good impression on the Fairchild family and that he was glad for it, and that he hoped Clarence understood what he was saying. I believe I do, Clarence said. Thomas was a good man, Cal said. I will not pretend otherwise. But Thomas is gone and Ella is alive and Lucy needs a father, and if you are the man who intends to provide that, I am not opposed to it. Thank you, Clarence said. Cal Briggs nodded once, refilled his cup from the coffee pot and returned to his chair. January was the coldest month, the kind of cold that made the air crystalline and brittle, that frosted the windows each night, and turned the mud of the main road into iron by morning. Clarence spent more time at Ella's than not, arriving each afternoon and staying through dinner and sitting by the fire after Lucy was in bed and talking, until the cold outside made the walk back to Mrs. Comstock's unpleasant enough to be an actual decision. They talked about everything. About the world beyond Harlan Creek, the transformation of Texas from a place of open frontier to something that was slowly organizing itself into counties and towns and law, the cattle drives that had defined the region in the 70s and were already beginning to diminish as the railroads changed the calculus of the beef industry, the question of the Plains tribes who had been moved to reservations in a process that Ella called, with characteristic directness, a profound injustice. And Clarence agreed and said that he had ridden through country that had been Comanche range 15 years before and was now fenced ranch land, and that the speed and the violence of that change was something that sat in the landscape like a scar if you knew where to look. My father used to say that the West was won, Ella said one evening. I never liked that phrase. It implies a contest where winning was clean and clear. It was not clean and it was not clear, and the cost of it was paid by people who did not choose to enter the contest. Your father sounds like an unusually thoughtful man for the time, Clarence said. He was a preacher before he was a farmer, she said. He had a sense of moral accounting. She was quiet a moment. He died 6 years ago, and my mother 2 years before him. Thomas's family were all back east and his parents had both passed. When Thomas died, there was just me and Vera and Cal and the children. It was a very small circle. It is bigger now, he said. She smiled, the small, contained smile that was becoming, without his having planned for it, one of the most important things in his daily life. Yes, she said, it is bigger now. He told her in February about a girl he had been serious about in his mid-20s, a girl in Fort Worth named Caroline Ferris, the daughter of a stockman he had worked for. They had been close to an engagement, and then the stockman had moved his operation to Kansas and taken his daughter with him, and Clarence had not been willing, at 25, to follow, because following had felt too much like giving up the motion that was keeping him alive. "Do you regret it?" Ella asked. "No," he said. "I think I cared for Caroline very much, but I was not ready for what she needed, and she was better off without me at 25. I think everything that happened since has been moving me toward being the man who would not have that same regret." "That is a kind way of reading your own history," she said. "I learned it from a woman who is very patient with the histories of others," he said, and she gave him the look that was half exasperation and half pleasure that he had learned to love. He asked her to marry him in March, when the first warmth was beginning to come back into the air, and the earliest wildflowers were beginning at the edges of the road, the tiny yellow ones that pushed up through the brown winter grass. He did not make it an elaborate thing. He was not a man given to elaborate gestures. He asked her in her kitchen, where they had cooked together and talked together and where she had wept and he had stayed, and he asked her simply and without the kind of theatrical performance that the moment did not require, because Ella Fairchild was a woman who valued plainness and truth over presentation. He said, "I know what I want. I wanted to be certain before I asked, because you deserve a man who is not uncertain. I am not uncertain anymore. I would like to marry you, Ella, if you will have me. I would like to make a life here, a real one, and be a proper father to Lucy if she and you would allow it. And I would like to wake up in this house and be in this kitchen for a very long time." She stood very still in the middle of her kitchen with a dishcloth in her hands, and she looked at him, and the expression on her face was the same one she had worn the first time the beans had smelled right, that unguarded, startled thing, the face of a person being surprised by the discovery that the world still contains good things. "Yes," she said. "Clarence, yes." He went to her and she came to him, and he held her in the kitchen in the March morning light, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stood together with no need for further words. Lucy's reaction, informed over breakfast the following morning, was immediate and decisive. She said, "Does that mean Mr. Maddox will live here?" And when Ella said yes, Lucy said, "Good," and went back to her oatmeal with the satisfaction of someone whose opinion has been vindicated. They were married in May. Reverend Aldous performed the ceremony in the small white church, and the congregation was the full complement of Harlan Creek. It seemed like the whole town had decided to attend, which was its own form of welcome and affirmation. Vera stood with Ella as her only attendant, and Cal Briggs sat in the front pew with the contained pleasure of a man who has been proven right about something he hoped for. Martha and old Hooper sat 3 rows back. Deacon the livery man was there, which Clarence had not expected. Turnbull and several of the ranchers were there. Mrs. Comstock was there in her best dress, and she wept during the ceremony with the liberality of a woman who has earned the right to weep at happy occasions. Ella wore a dress that was not blue and not faded, a pale ivory with small embroidered flowers at the collar that Vera had helped her make. She was the most beautiful thing Clarence had ever looked at, and he told her so in specific detail, which made her laugh and try to hide it and fail. They said their vows with a steadiness and a depth that filled the small church. Reverend Aldous had a gift for making the occasion feel both solemn and joyful without either quality undermining the other, and by the end of the ceremony there was not a dry eye in the building, including, Clarence noticed, Cal Briggs, who would have denied it if asked. The town threw them a wedding supper in the yard behind the church. tables set up and covered with food that half the town had contributed, pies and roasted chickens and fresh bread, and 3 different kinds of cake. There was a fiddle player and a guitar, and the evening ran late into the warm May night with dancing and laughter, and Lucy falling asleep in a chair with a piece of cake in her hand. Clarence danced with Ella in the yard under the hanging lanterns, and they danced badly and happily, and she laughed at him for stepping on her foot twice, and he told her it was an artistic decision, and she told him it was not, and they were both laughing, really laughing, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded, and he thought that there had been a time when he had not believed he would feel that kind of lightness, and he was profoundly grateful to have been wrong. Summer settled over Harlan Creek like a warm hand. Clarence moved into the house on the main road, and the house changed with his presence, in the small incremental ways that a home changes when it has reached its proper number of inhabitants. There were boots by the door that were not Ella's or Lucy's. There was a Winchester on the rack by the door. There was the smell of horse and outdoors, and the particular quality of tobacco that he smoked occasionally on the porch in the evenings. He expanded his veterinary work as the summer progressed, covering a wider radius of ranches and farms, and beginning to develop the kind of regional reputation that brought people to him, rather than requiring him to ride out in search of work. He treated a difficult case of cattle fever on the Turnbull Ranch that summer, a sustained and anxious week of quarantine and treatment and very careful monitoring, and when it resolved successfully, and Turnbull lost only 2 animals out of a potential loss of 20 or more, the rancher's gratitude was substantial and expressed partly in cash, and partly in the recommendation of Clarence's services to every man Turnbull knew. He and Ella cooked together on Sunday mornings. It became a ritual of their marriage, the 2 of them in the kitchen while Lucy was still asleep, making the large Sunday breakfast that would be on the table when she woke. They talked while they cooked, about the week and about plans and about the particular small things of daily life that accumulated into the substance of a shared existence. There was a pleasure in it that went beyond the food itself, something about the way 2 people in a kitchen together, moving around each other with the easy knowledge of familiar proximity, could constitute a kind of home that was more than the sum of its physical parts. Ella was wholly herself again in the kitchen. She cooked with confidence and creativity, trying new things and reviving old ones, and the house was always in possession of some good smell, baked bread or simmering stew or fresh-made pie, and Clarence never stopped appreciating this, because he had seen the alternative and he understood the distance she had traveled to get here. She did not forget Thomas. She never would, and Clarence never asked her to. The tintype photograph stayed on the mantelpiece, and on the anniversary of his death in November they put fresh wildflowers, the last ones of the season, in a small jar beside it, and Ella sat for a quiet hour by the fire, and Clarence gave her that time without intrusion. It was part of the honesty of their marriage, the acknowledgement that love does not erase love, that a heart that has loved before has not wasted that love but has been enlarged by it. Lucy took Clarence's name with the solemn deliberateness of someone making a considered legal and emotional decision, and she announced it to her teacher and classmates with the air of someone delivering important news. She called him Pa, not Father, not Mr. Maddox Pa, with the comfortable shortness of a word that fits easily in daily life, and the first time she said it without thinking, just reaching up to take his hand on the way to the store and saying, "Pa, can we go by the livery and see if Deacon's gray mare has had her foal yet?" Clarence had to look at the horizon for a moment and blink several times before he trusted his own expression. They were happy. Not in the uncomplicated way of people who have not yet encountered difficulty, but in the deeper way of people who know the cost of happiness and have therefore chosen it with full knowledge. They disagreed sometimes, because they were both strong-willed and direct, and their arguments were brief and honest and resolved by the same direct quality that made them good partners, neither of them being the kind to carry a grudge into the next morning. The following spring Ella told him she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast, matter-of-factly, watching his face over the coffee cup with an expression that was equal parts calm and uncertain. He set down his cup and looked at her, and the feeling that moved through him was something he had no prior framework for, a feeling of such completeness and such forward-reaching joy that it filled all the space in him at once. "When?" was what he managed to say. "October, I think," she said. "Vera says I look to be about 3 months along." He stood up from the table and went around it, and she stood up too, and he held her in the kitchen the way he had held her the day she said yes, with both arms and his whole attention. "Are you all right?" he said. With Lucy it was difficult, she had told him once in the winter, a long labor and a hard recovery. "I am fine," she said. "Vera says I am strong this time. And Dr. Alderman is much better at this than the man who was here when Lucy was born." She pulled back to look at him. "Are you all right?" he laughed. The laugh came from so far down that it surprised them both. "I am very much all right," he said. Lucy was informed and received the news with the pragmatic grace of a child who has reached the age of weighing information carefully. She asked several clarifying questions, including whether the baby would share her room, whether it would be a boy or a girl, and whether babies ate the same food as regular people. And having received satisfactory answers, she announced that she thought it would be acceptable and went back to her book. Ella laughed about this for an hour. The summer was warm and good. Ella slowed as her pregnancy progressed, but she did not stop, because she was constitutionally incapable of idleness, and Clarence had learned early in their marriage that attempting to limit her activities was a negotiation he was not going to win. He simply made sure there was always water within reach, and that she was never lifting things heavier than was reasonable, and she received this without argument because she understood the difference between being managed and being cared for. He had a house to think about. The house on the main road was fine. It had served 3 years of Ella's solitary life, and a year of their married life. But with a new baby and Lucy growing and the possibility of further children, it was becoming less adequate. He began drawing plans on paper in the evenings, rough architectural drawings that Ella would pick up and examine and amend with her own pencil, adding a window here or shifting a wall there, and their plans became increasingly specific through the summer, until they had something that looked like an actual blueprint for an actual house. He put the question to a builder in September, a man from a town 20 miles east who came recommended by Turnbull, and by the time their son was born in the first week of October, the new house was already staked out on the lot east of their current one, on a larger piece of land Clarence had bought from the adjacent property. The baby came on a Tuesday night in early October, the air sharp and clear outside the bedroom window, the same quality of October air that had been in the sky the day Clarence rode into Harlan Creek. Dr. Alderman was there, and Vera, and the labor was long but not dangerous, and at 11 o'clock at night a son arrived in the world with substantial opinions about it which he expressed immediately and at volume. They named him Henry Thomas Maddox, Henry for Clarence's father, because despite everything Clarence understood that you carry the people who made you, and Thomas for the man who had loved Ella first and whose memory was part of the fabric of this family. Ella had suggested Thomas and Clarence had said yes without hesitation, because it was exactly right, and because he was not a man threatened by the honest dimensions of his wife's heart. Henry Thomas Maddox was pink and furious and perfect, and he weighed a considerable amount, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and Lucy's immediate verdict was that he was actually quite good even though he was a baby, which she delivered while sitting on the bed beside her mother with a seriousness that made Dr. Alderman hide a smile behind his hand. Clarence held his son for the first time in the lamplight of their bedroom while Ella slept, and the house was quiet, Lucy long since put to bed by Vera, and the October wind moved through the cottonwoods outside with a sound like the turning of a page. He looked at the small, sleeping face and the small, clenching hands, and he thought about everything it had taken to get to this moment. The riding and the moving and the 14 years of not knowing what he was looking for. The smoke coming out of a kitchen window, the smell of burnt cornbread. A woman on a porch with a cast iron skillet, a pot of beans on a stove, a woman weeping and a man staying. He thought, this is the thing. This is the thing I was looking for. He was not wrong. The new house was finished the following spring. A solid frame house with a proper porch on 3 sides, 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen that Ella had designed with the specificity of a woman who intended to cook in it for decades, and a window over the kitchen sink that faced east so the morning light came in while she worked. They moved in on a Saturday in April with the help of Cal and Vera and 4 men from the ranches, and a considerable amount of food provided by Martha Hooper and several other women of the church, because that was how things were done in Harlan Creek, and it was one of the things Clarence had come to understand as the real substance of what it meant to live somewhere and belong to it. Ella stood in her new kitchen that first evening with Henry on her hip and Lucy at her side and Clarence behind her, all of them looking out the east window at the last of the April light across the brown and budding land, and she said, "This is ours," with a quiet certainty that was the most definitive statement Clarence had ever heard. "It is," he said. The years that followed were the kind that are not easily summarized because they are made of days, of the specific texture of ordinary life, which is the texture of happiness when you are living inside it. Clarence's practice grew until he was the most sought-after veterinarian in 3 counties, a fact he mentioned to no one, because he was not a man who needed to announce his own competence. He hired a boy of 16 named Tom Greer to help with the ranch calls, a thin, earnest young man who wanted to learn and applied himself with diligence that Clarence recognized from his own younger self. Lucy grew into herself with the directness and intelligence that had been evident from the beginning. She was 11, 12, 13, a tall, serious girl who read everything she could find and had opinions about all of it, and expressed those opinions without apology to anyone who would listen and several who would not. She learned to ride properly, and she helped with the horses, and she argued with her father about animal medicine in a way that told him she was paying close attention and had ideas of her own. He argued back with equal enthusiasm and enormous pride, and Ella watched these arguments from the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone watching something excellent unfold. Henry was walking and talking and getting into everything before anyone had quite prepared themselves for it. And then he was 3, and then 4. And then he was a compact, cheerful, fearless boy who liked horses and dogs with equal enthusiasm, and who had a relationship with risk that gave his parents consistent material for anxiety. He fell out of the apple tree 3 times in one summer, the last time earning a broken wrist which he treated as a trophy, and showed to everyone he encountered for 2 weeks. "He is exactly like Thomas when he was small," Vera told Ella one afternoon, watching Henry chase a chicken around the yard with focused determination. "Thomas broke his arm at 5 and wore the splint like a ribbon at a fair." Ella laughed and shook her head and leaned against the porch railing and watched her son with a full heart, and Vera reached over and squeezed her hand, and they stood together in the afternoon sun the way sisters do when they have been through enough together to not need to say the things that are true. 2 years after Henry, another pregnancy. This one arrived announced by the particular nausea of early weeks that Ella recognized immediately and took to Clarence with calm directness one morning over coffee. He set down the cup and looked at her with the same quality of attention he had given her the first time. She was 33 now, still strong and healthy, but she watched his face for concern. What she saw instead was joy, the same undisguised joy. She had always loved that about him, that he felt things directly and without shame about feeling them. "Are you pleased?" she said. "Profoundly," he said. "I am too," she said. This pregnancy was easier than the last, and the birth, in the winter of 1889, produced a daughter with red hair the color of autumn leaves who arrived as efficiently as though she were on a schedule, and who looked around the room with dark, serious eyes as though she were assessing the situation and finding it acceptable. They named her Clara Maddox. Clara for the daughter's own sake, me for Ella's mother. She was quiet as an infant and observant in the way that quiet infants sometimes are, taking everything in, storing it. Lucy, now 12, was enchanted by her in the way of a girl old enough to understand what a baby actually is, and to find it legitimately remarkable. She held Clara with careful competence and told her long stories about horses and the school and the time Henry fell out of the apple tree. And Clara listened with the deep attention of someone who is collecting data. Henry was 4 when Clara was born, and he regarded her with cautious interest for about a week, and then accepted her with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who has processed a new fact and moved on. Harlan Creek grew during those years, slowly the way frontier towns grow when the frontier is moving past them and leaving behind something more settled in its wake. New families came. A second church was built. The schoolhouse was enlarged. A newspaper started, a single-page weekly sheet run by a man named Beaumont who had come from Dallas with ink-stained hands and strong opinions about everything, which he expressed in print with cheerful abandon. The railroad was discussed extensively for several years, and then a spur line came through in 1887, 20 miles south of town, which changed the character of the cattle trade in the region and brought new money and new faces with it. Clarence watched these changes with the attentiveness of a man who had seen enough different landscapes to know that change comes whether you watch for it or not, and that the best you can do is tend the specific ground you have chosen and keep it sound. He tended his ground. His practice, his home, his family, the particular human ecosystem of Harlan Creek in which he had been a stranger, and had become as embedded as any man could become. He and Ella had their arguments, because every marriage of substance contains them, and their arguments were sometimes sharp and sometimes lasted longer than was comfortable. But they always came back to the same place, back to the kitchen and the dinner table and the fire in the evenings, because the foundation was too solid to be dislodged by weather that passed. There was one argument in their 3rd year of marriage that deserved the name serious. Clarence had been offered a position by a livestock operation in San Antonio, a proper position with a regular salary and a scope of practice that was ambitious and interesting, and he had come home with the offer and told Ella about it with the care of someone who has been walking around a thing for 2 days and knows it needs to be said. Ella had listened without interrupting. Then she had said, "Do you want to go?" "I want to know what you think," he said. "That is not what I asked," she said. He was quiet. "There is a part of me that is interested," he said, "professionally interested. It is a significant opportunity." "And the other part," she said. "The other part is standing in this kitchen," he said. "Then the other part has the better argument," she said. "But Clarence, I need you to be certain. I need to know that you are staying because it is what you want, not because you think you owe it to me." "I am staying because this is home," he said. "Because you and Lucy and Henry and this house and these ranches and these people are my home, and San Antonio is an opportunity and this is a life, and I know the difference." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she crossed the kitchen and kissed him in the middle of it, not gently, with the full force of a woman who loves a man, and is grateful that he knows the right thing without being told. He wrote a polite letter declining the San Antonio position, and felt no regret about it the following morning or any morning after. The years turned and the children grew and the work continued, and the life of the town accumulated around them like the rings of a tree, each year adding to the whole without displacing what came before. Turnbull retired and his son took over the ranch. Hooper's store passed to a younger man from Austin when Hooper's health began to fail, and Martha Hooper became a frequent presence at Ella's kitchen table in her husband's diminished health, and Ella received her with the warmth of someone who knows the weight of caring for a person who is slowly leaving. When Hooper died in the spring of 1890, Ella and Clarence both sat with Martha through the first terrible days of it, and one evening, sitting by Martha's fire while the older woman slept from exhaustion, Ella took Clarence's hand and held it, and she said quietly, "I remember what those first days were." "I know you do," he said. "I am glad you came to town," she said. "I am glad you smelled the cornbread burning." "The worst cornbread I have ever encountered," he said. "It was terrible," she agreed. "The beans were considerably better," he said. "The beans were excellent," she said with dignity. "I made those beans." "You did," he said, "with very little help." "With some help," she said. "A very small amount," he said. She was smiling, he was smiling. Martha Hooper slept in her chair, and outside the spring night was soft and dark, and in their own house down the road their 3 children were asleep under the care of Vera, who had come to stay, and everything that they had built together was there in the darkness, solid and present, the life they had made from a chance riding and a burnt meal, and a man who saw a woman not as broken but as a person in temporary need of a witness. They walked home in the spring dark hand in hand, the way they often did in the evenings, and the stars over Harlan Creek were the kind that made the sky seem close enough to touch, and the road was familiar under their feet, and ahead of them the windows of their house were lit warm and yellow in the darkness. Ella stopped walking. "What is it?" he said. She was looking at the house, at the warm windows. "Do you remember," she said, "what I said on the porch that first autumn, that the food had nowhere to go?" "I remember," he said. "I want you to know," she said, and her voice was steady and full at once, the voice of a woman who has arrived at a truth she has been carrying for some time and is finally setting it down, "that every meal I make now has somewhere to go, every single one. I cook for you and for Lucy and for Henry and for Clara, and I can taste it because I know who it is going toward. I know every face that will be at the table." She paused. "I know you know this, but I wanted to say it plainly." He stood in the dark road and looked at his wife and thought about everything that had led here, the long circling roads of 2 lives that had finally found their common direction and held it, and he said, "I am glad you let me stay." "I am glad you wanted to," she said. He pulled her hand and she came to him, and they stood in the road in the spring night with the stars above them and the warm house ahead, and everything behind them properly grieved and properly honored and fully released. And what remained in the space that released makes was exactly what it should be, which was forward, which was life, which was the 2 of them together going home. Lucy was 16 when she told her father she wanted to study medicine. Not veterinary medicine, human medicine, and she delivered this ambition with the absolute certainty of someone who has known it for a long time and is simply making it official. Clarence looked at her across the dinner table and thought about every argument they had ever had about anatomy and treatment and the science of living things, and he said, "We will find a way." Ella reached across the table and covered Lucy's hand with her own, and Lucy, who was not given to displays of sentiment, did not pull her hand away. It took considerable doing. Women's medical colleges existed. There was one in Philadelphia, and the logistics of a girl from a small Texas town accessing that kind of education required years of planning and saving and correspondence, and the leveraging of every connection Clarence had made in 20 years of work, and in Ella had made in a lifetime of being the kind of person that other people wanted to help. By the time Lucy was 18 and ready to go, they had secured for her a place, a sponsorship from a physician in Fort Worth who had been impressed by a letter she wrote to him detailing her observations of veterinary surgery, and enough money saved to cover 2 years before she would need to supplement by work. The morning Lucy left was the kind of morning that tests a family's collective composure. Henry, now 14, was quiet and red-eyed and tried very hard not to show it and failed. Clara, 9, cried openly and clung to her sister until Lucy gently disentangled herself and told her that she would write every week and that was a promise. Vera and Cal were there. Mrs. Comstock, ancient now and moving slowly, was there, because she said she had known Lucy since before she could tie her own shoes and she intended to see her off properly. Lucy embraced her mother for a long time. Ella held her the way you hold something you are releasing with full intention, completely and without reservation, because the releasing is itself an act of love. Then Lucy turned to Clarence and he embraced her and she said, quietly, so only he could hear, "Thank you, for everything, for staying." He held her tighter for one moment and then let her go. She climbed into the wagon that would take her to the railroad spur, and she looked back once from the road, and she was tall and clear-eyed and she looked like her mother, and then she faced forward and was gone. Ella pressed close to Clarence's side as they watched the wagon diminish down the road, and he put his arm around her and she put hers around him, and Henry came and put his arm around his mother's other side, and Clara held Henry's hand, and they stood together in the morning light watching the road long after the wagon was out of sight. "She will be extraordinary," Ella said. "She already is," Clarence said. Henry made a sound that was suspiciously like a suppressed sob, and then recovered his dignity entirely, and went to tend the horses with the purposeful stride of a boy who has decided to deal with his feelings through action. Clarence watched him go with recognition and affection. Clara looked up at her mother and said, "Is she coming back?" "For visits," Ella said, "and someday to stay when she is a doctor and has found her place." "Will her place be here?" "I do not know," Ella said honestly, "but she will always know where home is. That is the important thing." Clara considered this and appeared to accept it, and she went inside to feed her cat, who was named Doctor in an interesting foreshadowing that none of them had noticed when it was named. Life in the Maddox house had its rhythms and its seasons, and the years of the late 1880s and early 1890s were the years of those rhythms deepening, of the particular richness that comes to a life that has been lived long enough to have accumulated history and warmth. Ella and Clarence were in their middle 30s, and then their late 30s, and they moved through those years with the ease of two people who have found the shape of their life together and settled into it without settling for it. They were interested in each other. This was the thing that struck the people around them most, not the obvious affection, though that was evident, but the specific quality of interest. Ella brought news from the town and Clarence brought news from the ranches, and they spread it all out at the dinner table and turned it over together, and nothing in either world was too small to be worth talking about. He taught Henry everything he knew about horses and more than that, about the ethics of it, about what it meant to be responsible for an animal's welfare, about reading the signs of pain in a creature that cannot speak them. Henry absorbed it all and added to it his own natural instinct for the work, and by the time he was 16, he was genuinely useful on the ranch calls, and the ranchers asked for him by name. He was easier in temperament than his father. Where Clarence was measured and careful, Henry was warm and quick. His mother's directness crossed with his father's steadiness, and he had a way with frightened animals that came from somewhere innate. Clara grew into a thoughtful, observant girl who wrote poetry in secret, and showed it to no one for a long time, and then showed it to Ella, who read it with the careful attention of someone who knows she is holding something precious, and told Clara that it was very good and very true, and Clara looked at her with the expression of someone who has expected skepticism, and received the opposite, and does not yet know what to do with it. "You should keep writing," Ella said. "It is not a useful thing," Clara said. This was a common refrain in the practical world of the frontier. "Useful is not the only kind of valuable," Ella said. "Your grandfather, the preacher, would have agreed with me." Clara kept writing. Lucy came home for Christmas in her second year of medical school, and she was different in the way that people are different when they have been living inside their own ambition and finding it exactly right. She was confident in a new way, and she brought with her a friend from Philadelphia, a young woman named Agatha who was also studying medicine, and who was from Boston and had never been west of Ohio, and who looked at the Texas landscape with undisguised amazement. Ella fed them both for 2 weeks with the expansive generosity of someone cooking for the pure pleasure of it, and Agatha told her 3 times that she had never eaten so well in her life. And Ella received this, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who knows exactly what her cooking means and is glad for it. Clarence watched Lucy move through those 2 Christmas weeks, and he saw a person fully in possession of herself, fully in motion toward the life she had chosen, and he felt the satisfaction of it deep in the chest where things that matter are stored. When she left again, there were fewer tears, though the parting was no less genuine. They were all learning to let each other go properly, which is its own form of love. The spring of 1892 brought good things. Henry, at 17, had grown into someone you noticed, tall and easy and capable, and he had begun spending time with the Briggs girl, not Vera's daughter who was younger, but a girl from a family who had come to Harlan Creek 2 years before, a girl named Sarah Briggs who was 17 herself and who had, from Ella's careful and amused observation, entirely captured Henry's attention. "He follows her with his eyes," Ella told Clarence in bed one evening. "Yes," Clarence said, "he does." "Do you remember doing that?" He turned his head to look at her. They were lying in the comfortable darkness of their room, the April night soft outside the window, the house quiet. "I remember standing in the road in front of your house pretending I was not staring at you and being very bad at it," he said. She laughed. "You were obvious. I was hoping I was subtle." "You were not subtle at all," she said, "but it was endearing." He reached over and took her hand in the dark, the way he had done thousands of times in the years of their marriage, and she turned her hand and held his, and they lay together in the April dark, and the house breathed around them with the particular quality of a house that has been fully lived in and fully loved. "Clarence," she said, "are you happy?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because the question deserved a full answer and he wanted to give it one. "I am," he said. "I am happier than I knew how to be when I came to Harlan Creek. I am happier than I thought was available to me." He paused. "I think I was very hungry for a long time, and I did not know what I was hungry for." She squeezed his hand. "You were feeding motion," she said, "not hunger." He laughed, the sudden genuine laugh that she had always been able to produce in him. "You have been saving that for years," he said. "I have," she admitted. "I thought it was very good." "It is very good," he said. "I learned from someone," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to the back of it, and she curled closer to him in the dark. And outside the spring night went on in its unhurried way, and the cottonwoods were putting out their new leaves, and the stars above Harlan Creek were steady and clear. And the house was full of sleep and warmth, and all the particular goodness of a life that had been built honestly from difficult materials and had held. In the morning, Ella rose early, as she always did, and went to the kitchen and put the fire on and started the coffee. She stood at the east window while the water heated and watched the light come up over the land, the way it came every morning, slow and certain, turning the brown grass gold, and then ordinary, and then simply the morning. And she thought about the 10 years since a stranger had ridden into town and smelled her burnt cornbread, and decided for reasons she had never quite stopped being grateful for that her grief was worth his patience. She thought about Thomas, the way she always did in the early mornings, with the gentle honesty of someone who has integrated a loss rather than buried it. She thought about what he would have made of Clarence Maddox, and she thought, as she had thought many times, that he would have liked him. Thomas had been a man who valued directness and competence and care, and Clarence was all of those things. She heard Clarence's step on the stairs, the familiar weight of it, and then he was in the kitchen doorway with his hair unsettled and his boots not yet on, and she handed him his coffee without turning from the window. He came and stood beside her, and they looked out at the morning together. "Henry's colt is due any day," he said. "I know it," she said. "He has been checking the mare every 2 hours." "He is more anxious about it than I was at his first difficult birth," Clarence said. "He cares deeply," she said. "He does," Clarence agreed. There was pride in it, uncomplicated and full. Clara was up late writing again. "I know that too," Ella said. "You know everything that happens in this house," he said. "I cook 3 meals a day for it," she said. "If I did not know what was happening, I would not be cooking right." He smiled at his coffee. She felt the smile without seeing it, the way you feel things in someone you know with the entirety of your accumulated days. "What are you making for breakfast?" "Biscuits," she said. "And the eggs from yesterday if Henry remembered to bring them in, and that ham that Turnbull sent over." "That is a very good breakfast," he said. "I know it," she said. He put his arm around her shoulder and she leaned into him slightly, and the morning came in through the east window of the kitchen she had designed for exactly this, for mornings and light, and the presence of a person she loved beside her while she cooked with full intention, with full flavor, with every bite meant for someone, and every meal an act of love directed not into an empty grief, but into the warm and present and extraordinary ordinary life that they had made. The biscuits rose golden and ripe. The kitchen filled with the smell of good food and fresh coffee, and the specific warmth of a morning that was both utterly familiar and still, after all these years, still good. Still, in its small and irreplaceable way, a miracle. Outside, Henry's voice carried from the barn, calling something about the mare, his voice cracking the morning wide open with young urgency and life. And Clara appeared at the kitchen door still in her nightgown, her dark hair loose, asking if the mare was foaling, and Ella said not yet but soon. And Clara said she wanted to see it, and Ella said then eat your breakfast first. And Clara sat at the table with the automatic obedience of a child, who has learned that arguing with her mother before breakfast is not a productive use of anyone's time. Clarence put his coffee down and went to the barn to check on the mare, because that was what he did, and Ella watched him go through the kitchen window and then turned back to the stove and served the biscuits onto the plate, and the morning was whole and warm and hers, and the food was good, and the hunger that it fed was real and present, and exactly what she had needed it to be. Henry's colt arrived that afternoon, a long-legged bay with a white star, born without complication after an hour of attentive waiting, and Henry stood in the stall afterward with his hands on his knees, and his face flushed and said, with the breathless honesty of someone who has witnessed something fundamental and important, "That is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen." And Clarence, beside him, looked at his son's face and thought exactly the same thing. They named the colt Star, which was not a very original name but was the right one, and he was Henry's horse from that first hour, and Star knew it too, the way horses know the people who have loved them into the world. Lucy came home for summer, having completed her second year, and she was almost done. One more year and then her residency, and then she would be Dr. Lucy Fairchild Maddox, and the thought of it made Ella put down her dish towel and stand still in the middle of the kitchen for a moment with her hand over her heart. And Clara looked up from the table and asked if she was all right, and Ella said, yes, she was more than all right, and Clara said, you are crying, and Ella said, I know it. And Clara came and stood beside her, and held her hand in the careful way of a child, who has learned from observation how to be present without being intrusive. They were all home that summer, all 5 of them, and Vera and Cal came over Sunday afternoons, and the table was full and loud, and the food was abundant and right. And in the evenings when the children were settled and the house was quiet, Ella and Clarence sat on the porch and watched the stars come up over the land they had chosen and held together, and everything that had been broken in the years before was healed now, properly healed. Not hidden or papered over, but knit back into the whole with the strong, honest thread of time and love, and the particular mercy of 2 people who had found each other, when finding was what they each most needed. The summer went warm and golden to its end, the way good summers do, slowly and then all at once, and by September Lucy was gone again, and Henry was back at his work, and Clara was back at school, and the house settled into its autumn rhythm, the familiar creaking of the old frame in the first cold nights, the smell of the stove being lit in the mornings, the cottonwoods going gold outside the east window. Ella stood at that window on an October morning, 10 years and some weeks from the day a stranger had ridden into town and changed the direction of everything, and she thought about what she would tell a younger version of herself if she could, The woman who had stood on the porch with the cast iron skillet and the smoke coming out of the window and the flat gray nothingness of a life that had lost its flavor. She thought, I would tell her to hold on, that the flavor comes back. That it comes back with more depth than it had before because grief, properly grieved, does not diminish love, it expands the capacity for it. That the food will taste right again. That the kitchen will be full again. That there is a morning coming that smells like coffee and biscuits and the specific irreplaceable smell of a life worth living, and you will stand in it and know it for what it is. She would tell her, someone is going to smell the cornbread burning and he is going to stay. Let him stay. She made the coffee and started the biscuits and listened to the house wake around her. Feet on the stairs and a door opening and the particular sound of a family in motion, alive and real and present. And the morning light came in through the east window and fell across the kitchen floor in a long, warm bar of gold. And Ella Fairchild Maddox stood in it and cooked with her whole heart and fed everyone she loved. And it was good. It was very good. It was, in every way that mattered and in all the ways that do not announce themselves, but simply are, exactly enough.